Hello guys, welcome to the second part of the OCA strike against the split airfield. I'm sitting on an Amendola airfield, currently in an F-16 MLU or midlife update.
Hold short.
It should be the Dutch F-16 according to the, okay, it's Dutch, according to the insignia or marking. Oh, I was trying to see my wingman, but I forgot that I'm alone here in this flight. It's very unusual for me to fly like any mission in the Falcon 4 alone.
Weasel 1-1, request clearance for departure.
Weasel 1-1, Amendola Tower, position and hold, runway 29.
Usually every mission planned by the automatic ATO is 2, 3, 4 aircrafts. Like you will be never in a single ship formation in any mission. Just the U2 for the reconnaissance missions are flying like alone. Okay.
Weasel 1-1, Amendola Tower, you are cleared for takeoff. Runway 29, depart heading 200.
So depart heading 200.
Altitude, 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 altitude.
I'm going to save as much fuel as possible. Okay, 200.
Weasel 1-1, Amendola departure, resume own navigation.
Weasel 1-1, roger, resuming own navigation. So let's head to the steer point 2. And I'll try to be as slow as possible over the Adriatic Sea. Just to save as much fuel as possible. Gonna use the jammer. Okay, let's switch off the lights. 5 AMRAAMs C4s. Okay, great. 1 harm, 6 PLUs. Let's set up to drop all 6 of them with the separation 900. Enter, okay. That's the profile 1. Okay, let's keep the profile 1 setup only. 6 singles, 900 feet spacing. That's it. Okay, that's all I have. Last thing, external central, just to show me the amount of fuel when I just watch a dig gauge. Let me use a little bit of time acceleration. This is pretty safe area here. Okay. I have to switch off the time acceleration not to ditch into the water. And I will try to sneak my way out into the enemy base, basically, and surprise them.
Altitude, 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 altitude.
Take it by
altitude,
surprise.
Altitude, altitude, altitude.
Okay, 100 feet.
Altitude, altitude, altitude.
Let's level up.
Altitude, 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 altitude,
Okay.
altitude, 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 altitude.
I'm sorry for the altitude warning. It's really annoying.
Altitude, 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 altitude.
It's when you fly lower than the 300.
Altitude, 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 altitude.
Maybe I can somehow switch it off.
Altitude, 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 altitude.
Unfortunately, I don't know how.
Altitude, 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 altitude.
I'm like a surfer now.
Altitude, 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 altitude.
Even if I switch off the radar, there is still this warning.
Altitude, 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 altitude.
And I do not want to fly in like 300 feet just to
altitude, altitude, altitude,
just to get rid of this altitude warning, or should I don't know.
Altitude, 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 altitude.
I'm already closing to this steer point 2, which is somewhere in the middle of the Adriatic Sea.
Altitude, altitude, altitude.
Okay, let's climb to 300.
Altitude, 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 altitude.
Okay, finally got quiet. I hope I'm low enough to not get locked by any fighter above me, but I'm not sure at this altitude. Definitely some ground stations might be able to see me. Okay, no. We'll see, okay. Okay, radar warning receiver seems to be working. Okay, I'll be crossing the steer point 2 very soon. It's here in the water in front of me.
Chalice 2, Weasel 1-1. Request vector to
Altitude, altitude,
Weasel
altitude,
1, Chalice 2,
altitude.
nearest threat, Bogey, bearing 005. 40 miles, 25,000.
Okay, so far 40 miles from me, so that's okay. That's not so close. What's the fuel state? 7,500. Okay, I'm flying over the steer point 2 right now. Okay, switching to steer point 3. There is something on my radar currently. It's definitely a bandit. I do not expect any friendly aircraft there, and it's directly onto the steer point 4.
Altitude.
But I should be turning to the target, so that's a slight complication for me. Maybe I will need to fly lower from the steer point, let's say 3, 4, 5, 6, and then I can climb again into the 300 feet altitude. Okay, another target.
Altitude.
Another target onto this radar. It's not jamming. 16,000 feet.
Chalice 2, Weasel 1-1, declare.
18,000.
Weasel 1-1, Chalice 2, contact confirmed hostile.
Okay, no identification for me, unfortunate.
Chalice 2, Weasel 1-1, request vector confirmed.
Altitude.
Weasel 1, Chalice 2, nearest threat, Ogie, bearing 340, 30 miles, 25,000.
Okay, 30 miles, 340, so basically 30 degrees to the left from me.
Altitude.
I'm going to cross these mountains as low as possible. This is some kind of island in the Adriatic Sea, and it's providing me a great cover from this split airfield.
Altitude.
Weasel 1, Chalice 2, be advised.
Pull up.
Hostile aircraft bearing 345, 25 miles, 26,000.
Altitude.
Okay, going to drop the external fuel tank. It fell into the water. I heard that. Interesting detail. 2,500, let's say. Next warning for me that I should be somewhere on my way back already. Okay, steer point 3, steer point 4. Let's go for it. I'm sorry for that warning, guys. Honestly, I didn't think about it that if I will be flying such low, that there will be a warning half the time in the video. So maybe just mute the video or put down the volume. I can see the split airfield on the left side, basically. It's there in the distance, and I can see some objects flying over the airfield in the 2,000, 5,000, something like that.
Weasel 1, Chalice 2, be advised. Hostile aircraft, Chalice 2, Weasel 1-1, request vector confirmed. Weasel 1, Chalice 2, nearest threat, Ogie, bearing 295, 35 miles, 25,000.
Altitude.
So far, no
Altitude.
bogies here.
Altitude. Altitude. Altitude.
Okay, crossing steer
Altitude.
point 4,
Altitude.
switching to
Altitude.
steer point 5, which is the runway already.
Altitude. 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 Altitude.
Just before I will be trying to hit the runway, I have to fly a little bit higher,
Altitude.
just to see the runway and allow my Durandals to open up in the air.
Altitude. 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 Altitude.
So behind this wall, I'm gonna climb a little bit.
Altitude. 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 Altitude.
So far, no SA6 here.
Flare.
Oh, Manpet. I do not see the runway, though. Seems like it's completely out of my course, out of my heading. That's not good. That's definitely not good.
Altitude. 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 Warning. Warning.
I'm sorry for that. I was really hoping that I won't be scratching that hill. But the runway should be hit at least few times. I was really low for just one BLU activated, but this airfield is out of operation. It ended up pretty badly. I should be just returning now, so without any problems. We're smoking something here. Maybe the Durandal fall off slightly left. I was in not the correct altitude for the Durandal drop. Basically, just in the middle. I was slightly higher. But there was lots of AAA, lots of infrared, some systems. The SA6 definitely was somewhere here. I saw a radar warning, so it was locking me. Anyway, I'm going to save this mission. It ended up pretty badly for me, but good for the campaign. The split airfield should be out of action for a pretty decent time now. SA14, 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 SA16, 19, 14, 14, SA7. I don't know, 10, 11 missiles. That's great. Okay. And if they do not destroy you, you will destroy yourself into the hill.
Lobo 21 SA6 active bullseye 045 35 miles.
Split airport 0% operational. No damage. This runway destroyed. So basically, luckily it's in the middle of the runway. But it won't take too long for the engineering squad to repair this runway. I'm pretty sure about that. So I need to capitalize this self as much as possible. I'm going to attack the Dubrovnik, Tivat, Mostar air bases as fast as possible, or as soon as possible. As you can see, it's pretty too many enemies in the air. Or maybe I should focus on the Zadar airport now. Let me quickly check the Zadar airport. Zadar. MiG-21 only. About Udbina.
Panther 1, let's go home.
Okay, no problem. Split is out of operation. What about Mostar? Looks really
Chalice 2, be
dangerous.
advised, enemy aircraft launch activity detected. Bullseye 065, 140 miles.
Mostar, I don't have any recon on this airfield. Looks like no squadron is there. It has like 2 runways. Dubrovnik International. Oh, Su-32, so definitely this should be my next target. Tivat Airport. Okay, MiG-29s. Podgorica is also dangerous, I remember that. J-22 and Camo 50. Okay, no big deal. So I should go for the Dubrovnik in my next mission. So I'm going to save this carrier here, and the next mission will be Dubrovnik. I will try to do it like the normal way, like the normal level flight, not like this. I will take definitely some harms with me. There should be some air defenses nearby, or maybe I will destroy these air defenses over this Mostar as well. Okay, so all the aircrafts which are currently in the air should be diverted into other airfields than Split. So if they originate the Split, they will be landing on other airfields. Therefore, they will be still in action for a certain amount of time. Therefore, I need to really go one by one and destroy all these airfields just to ground as many aircrafts as possible. Yeah, that's really important in this phase of the war. It's 13 or 1 p.m. basically, so the war is going from 8 or 9 probably, I don't know, a.m. So probably going for 5 hours already, and finally I was able to disable at least one airfield. It would be much easier now to attack Split in the upcoming hours. Just you need to drop the bombs without any problems, and before you did it, just to destroy this SA-6 there, which is probably still somewhere there. SA-3 maybe. I was locked by some radar, some system from the ground, that area. Okay, going to cancel these flights now, both of them. Just to make some room for the OCA strike. Okay. For the Dubrovnik. Check it once again. Dubrovnik was the Su-32s, right? Dubrovnik, yeah, okay. So let's go for the Dubrovnik. I'm going to plan the OCA strike now. Okay, let's say just 2 F-16s, Amendola target Dubrovnik International. Okay, and I received 2 aircrafts. Pretty short flight. Okay, gonna save it here. This will be my next mission. Then I will attack this Tivat. Maybe I can already plan flight. Oh, I will do that after I return from this one. I don't know the time, exact time when I will be back on my base. So, guys, thank you for watching this video. As always, have fun, take care, stay tuned for my next video for the Dubrovnik OCA strike. Hopefully, I will disable this airfield again. Then I will be simply continue from the coast to the inner part of the Serbia to destroy all the airfields basically, or all the main airfields, and destroy all the air defenses which might be spread all around this big country. Maybe I can focus on some boats while flying over them, I can always take some, let's say two Mavericks more, one for me, one for wingman, and attack any of these OSA missile boats. Okay guys, thank you for watching. See you in my next video. Bye.